Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. Attendees, thank you very much for joining today and welcome to this online training on mapping tourism value chain. It's the very first online training that is organized by the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program. And before we start, let me introduce you to the Sustainable Tourism Program if you don't know it already. This is a network of over 160 organizations that are comprising governments, private sectors, NGOs, international organizations, academia, that are all collaborating together to advance sustainable consumption and production. The One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program has the overall objective of enhancing the sustainable development impacts of the tourism sector by 2030, and by developing, promoting, as well as scaling up sustainable consumption and production practices in order to boost the efficient use of natural resources and produce less waste, and address the challenges of climate change and biodiversity. So with this small introduction, I wanted to welcome you all to this first training. And my name is Sandra Averus-Monry. I'm a program officer at UN Environment, and I will be conducting the training together with Mark Bartel that will introduce himself to all of you. Mark?
Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Bartel. I am a partner at a sustainability and resilience practice called 3Kill, which is based in Oxford in the UK. And I've been working on the Transforming Tourism Value Chains project for just over 2 years now.
Thank you very much, Mark. And so to just give you a very quick introduction of this first training, it's developed within the project that Mark just mentioned on transforming tourism value chains in developing countries and small islands and developing states. It aims at accelerating more resource efficient, low carbon development, and the training is organized in partnership with UN Environment, RAP, and 3Kill. The project itself is funded by the German government's initiative called International Climate Change Initiative, or ICI. So we're very thankful for their support. Prior to going deeper into the objective of this specific online training, I would like to provide you with a few technical instructions so that we have a smooth session. So as you have probably noted, you are all in listen-only mode, and please make sure that you are muted and that your web camera is off. You can ask questions to the panelists, so to Mark and myself anytime through the webinar, throughout the webinar, and you can do so by posting your question in the chat box, which is on the control panel, this column that you have, and the chat box should be towards the below part of the column. So we will be responding to question and answer during the presentation. So we will stop at some specific time of the presentation to respond to questions. If some are generic or are remaining, we'll try to address them towards the end of the webinar. And well, yesterday we conducted the webinar and had more than 30 questions, so please bear with us if we don't manage to answer everything. So there will be a further Q&A session, question and answer session at the end of the webinar. And finally, the session is being recorded and the YouTube link will be sent to you and posted on the One Planet Clearinghouse and the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program web page tomorrow. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the outline content of the training today. So we will go through introduction and overview, and then I'll hand over to Mark that will cover the chapters related to mapping the tourism value chain, we will pause after this chapter 2 for some questions and answer. Then Mark will continue with the actors and influencers of the value chain, the life cycle impacts, and the hotspot analysis. And of course, we'll go into more detail into the meaning of these words during the chapters. After chapter 5, we will again pause for question and answers. And then Mark will continue on presenting how to identify existing initiatives as well as shortlisting solutions. We will pause again for question and answer, and then I'll provide an overview of a couple of tools, one for mainly the private sector to develop a business case, and one related to supportive policy framework. So the guidance is really intended to help you to develop a value chain map and to make sure that as multi-actors all together, the group related to the tourism sector is able to identify and prioritize the life cycle environmental impacts that are associated with the value chain of tourism. To understand better how to use and how to motivate the different partners to address the issues, the key hotspots. Then to work on finding together a range of solutions to make sure that resource efficiency and a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions are implemented in the tourism sector. And finally, to build a business case and build a supporting policy framework. So this guidance is a step-by-step guidance, and the 1 hour and a half is quite dense. We'll go through it together with Mark, but you will receive the slide deck, and you will also note that there are further notes below the slide that are providing additional guidance, as well as editable templates so that you can yourself map your value chain and go through the different stages that we will present. So we hope these will be helpful. So in order to start with the concepts and definition and make sure we're all on the same page, and before handing over to Mark, I wanted to highlight why we're speaking of a value chain and why this is in the title of the training today. So a supply chain is defined as the entire process of making and selling commercial goods, including every stage from the supply of material, the manufacturing of the good, and through the distribution and sale. So this is the orange arrow on the figure that you're seeing now. The reason why we intentionally talk about value chain is because our aim is to go through all the stages of the cycle that you're seeing here. So indeed, from raw material to manufacture and distribution and use, but to take also into account the end of life of the product and to understand the impacts at end of life as well as in the other stages. The reason why we are referring to value chain as well is because the objective, and you will see it in a couple of slides, is to look at the environmental value, but also the economic and the social value, and to understand where this value lies and how to make the best use of it. And finally, and because it is linked, how to address the different life cycle impact is mainly through a systemic approach with many stakeholders. And so this is why you're seeing here in the figure some small drawings that are in let's say in yellow or green. They represent like all the actors that are involved. So when we when we define value chain, we define it through the ISO definition as the entire sequence of activities or parties that provide or receive value in the form of a product or services. So they can be the workers, they can be the tourists, so your staff in hotels, but also those who provide supplies, the food supplier, the intermediary, going towards the agriculture grower, as well as the end-of-life players, waste management companies and authorities, and some actors such as research and development, investors, policymakers that can be seen as indirect actors. So with this, I'll hand over to Mark for presenting you the section on value chain. Mark, you should have received the hand now.
Thank you, Sandra. So let me take you through the first step, which is looking at what mapping a value chain looks like. And just a sort of introduction and overview as well. So as Sandra's already said, that when you take a value chain perspective in tourism or in any other sector of the economy for that matter, it's all about extending the line of sight that you have, both upstream to primary producers or material suppliers, or downstream to consumers, guests, tourists, and the end-of-life management of wastes, and including wastewater. So it's really important that we move beyond that kind of traditional focus in supply chains, which is quite limited and tends to focus on simply looking or interacting with tier one suppliers and going right back upstream to where the material has come from or where the agricultural products come from. So we're looking effectively at a more comprehensive look at the entire commodity or service chain. We're trying to create a map of the structure of the value chain, all of those that sit within it, and how they interact. So any map that you produce really should look both upstream to the primary producers and the raw materials, in the middle to intermediate suppliers and service providers, and downstream to those consumers and end-of-life management. And wherever possible, and this is quite important in some tourism sectors, some tourism destinations, also try and include consideration of some of those indirect stakeholders. So relevant government ministries that might be able to provide support to you, or agencies or bodies, R&D organizations, or financial or investment institutions as well. And the reason I say that is because a lot of these organizations are sources of information that can help you to build your value chain map. And I'll show you a bit more detail about how to gather the data to build your value chain map a little later on in this presentation. The other key aim really with value chain mapping is to limit the risk of any lack of resilience or loss of resilience in the supply chain, and to try and add value as much as possible at each stage in the value chain. And then also to guide the activities to be taken within the value chain when you're thinking about how to address key environmental hotspots, key environmental impacts, any threats or opportunities within the value chain, and to also identify and create new partnerships and collaborations that could help you to address or capitalize on these opportunities or impacts. So wherever possible, as Sandra said, you should try and ensure that your map is multifaceted. So it should contain operational, economic, environmental, and social information as well. And it can be drawn from both top-down national or tourism sector statistics and information to bottom-up primary data collection, which is gathered through value chain partners, other stakeholders, for example, like trade bodies and NGOs. So this is really a kind of a holistic view of a value chain in tourism. And just to give you an idea of how we've tried to visualize this within the Transforming Tourism Value Chains project, this is the template that we have been using throughout the project to try and visualize how the value chain in tourism works. And it was adapted by UN Environment from some work from the International Trade Center and the UNWTO. So you'll see on the left-hand side in green, These are all the kind of typical activities you would expect to see in a tourism value chain prior to traveling to a destination as a tourist. So things like the goods and services relating to the promotion of the destination, the travel organizations and booking systems, travel agents, airlines, call centers, and tour operators and wholesalers. So all of those fall to the left-hand side, but outside of the destination itself. Then we move into the middle of the value chain map, and this is sort of split into a number of different segments as well. So if you look at the top, what we're trying to capture here is information on supporting institutions. So ministries of tourism, trade, commerce, infrastructure, environment, climate change, culture, and so on. And these, as I said before, is because it's really good to actually get an understanding of who could support you in any endeavor around building a value chain map or identifying any environmental impacts associated with tourism destinations, or even at a national level or at a business level. Then below that, we have a recognition that in order for tourism to function, there are a number of resources, both man-made and natural, that are required. So energy provision, water provision, the natural environment, food and beverages, other materials associated with things like hotel infrastructure, restaurants, construction of roads and logistics chains, all of those sorts of things. And then below that, particularly on the left-hand side of this top block within the middle, you have things like customs offices, port authorities, ministries of transport. So those ministries that are in effect helping to run the tourism sector. And then the rest of that top section in the middle there is really about the upstream value chain partners within tourism. So those that provide or manufacture and provide food and drink, those that manufacture and create handicrafts and souvenirs for the industry. And then moving sort of to the right of that top section, things like how do you maintain your tourism assets? So site restoration, site management, site maintenance, and things like the sort of leisure activities like wellness equipment, wellness services. I'm going to draw your attention also then to the middle of this section, because I'm going to talk a bit about this in a bit more detail in a minute. So the big dark blue blocks here, so transportation, accommodation, food and beverage, and so on, are really intended to show the different facets of the value chain and how they interact. So with transportation, you would try to capture every mode of transportation that is available in a particular destination. For accommodation, you would do the same. So is this an accommodation sector within a destination that maybe it's dominated by all-inclusive, or it could be more focused on guest houses and informal Airbnb type setups. But it's just trying to get a sense of the shape and the nature of the tourism sector. And then obviously the same with food and beverage, what bars and restaurants can you call upon, what nightclubs, what street food, and so on, right the way down to things like the provision of food souvenirs to tourists. Across the way to creative industries as well. So what are the sort of leisure and shopping opportunities within tourism destinations? And then critically, tourism assets. And when we talk about tourism assets, when we do value chain mapping in tourism, we talk principally about three key variables. The first being cultural assets, so archaeology, music, museums, festivals, the sort of things that attract tourists to a destination. Similarly, with natural assets, so lakes, rivers, reefs, pristine beaches, mountains, wildlife, etc. And then finally, built assets. So infrastructure, architecture, utilities, anything that helps people to move around within a destination and provide services to them. And then, of course, there's the service side of destination, like leisure, tours and excursions, and finally, support services. So all of this central block is how we'd visualize the value chain in and around the destination. And then on the right-hand side, you see these orange boxes, and these are really intended to highlight some of the environmental impacts that we might want to look at, and we'll talk about this in more detail in a second. So it could be anything from the amount of food waste that's generated in a destination, or the amount of packaging waste. It could be the amount of wastewater that has to be treated, or it could be land use change and how that affects something like biodiversity loss. So all of these things are intended to kind of help us to categorize the different types of environmental impact we might come across in a tourism value chain. And it's important to note that we should look right the way across effectively the life cycle, or the different transitions represented by these blue blocks within the diagram, so that we're managing all the stages of the tourism value chain and thinking about the environmental impacts as we go through from out of destination to in destination, and all the things you can do within a destination. So it's quite a useful way of visualizing in a very concise way the way a value chain might be shaped. And what we'll do over the course of the next few sections on the presentation is show you how you can build from this template and include different attributes within the template. So one of the first things really that is important to understand is to agree, when you're thinking about constructing a map of the tourism value chain, what is the objective of doing that? What is your primary objective and secondary objectives in doing that? And what is the scope of the value chain map that you're looking at? And that's really important, because the scope of what you're looking at and what you're trying to achieve is a critically important step in trying to understand the depth, the breadth, and the types of data and information required to produce your value chain map. So, for example, as a policymaker, you might want to gain a better understanding of the tourism value chain at a national level. Or you might want to understand the relevant value chain actors, expenditure patterns, environmental impacts at a key destination level. Whereas as a tourism business, you might want to be operating at a slightly more micro level and use your map to visualize all of your value chain partners to better understand your direct environmental impact and theirs as well, and use your relationship with suppliers or your ability to influence guests to drive positive change and take action on some of these key environmental impact hotspots we'll talk about in a minute. So if I move on, and I'm going to try and keep this as jargon-free as possible. So in exactly the same way as we use a value chain perspective rather than a supply chain perspective to open our eyes and take a more holistic view of the tourism value chain, when we take a life cycle view of things, we do the same. So as Sandra said earlier, we're interested in understanding the full suite of processes, activities, and materials that go into a tourism value chain, whether it's looking at the raw materials and resource needs for the value chain, whether it's about what manufacturing and production activities take place, and that can include service provision, what distribution and sales of products and services are required, how they are used or consumed, and how are they disposed, recycled, or reused, either within the value chain in tourism or outside of it. So for us, taking this whole life view of tourism will really help you to kind of structure your value chain map. It helps you to think about all of the activity taking place in the value chain, from where your materials and food and beverage products might come from, to how the whole sector or the business operates and is maintained. And it can also help you to start thinking about how to become more resource efficient, how to use less materials, how to reduce the amount of waste you use, or reduce the amount of greenhouse gas emissions from your operations.
Mark, let me just interrupt for a second to remind all the attendees that they can, and especially those who just joined, that they can write their questions, in particularly clarification questions, in the chat, and that we will pose in some minutes for responding to these questions.
Thank you, Sandra. Okay. So let's move on to think about, so what we want to try and do here is give everyone a sense of where the data can come from. So when we've developed these value chain maps within the Transforming Tourism project, we've obviously gone to quite a wide range of sources. So in this case, what this slide is showing you is that there are a number of national, international, destination level and business level data sets that you could turn to actually start to build your value chain map. So value chain data sources, in other words, who is operating within a destination or at a national level, the sort of data sources you can go to include those held by ministries of tourism and trade. At an international level, the UN World Tourism Organization, or the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, which has an incredible array of data around food and beverage use in all sorts of different sectors of the economy. the World Travel and Tourism Council, and then sort of moving to the kind of national and sectoral level, things like the data and information that's held by industry or trade bodies, national statistics bureaus, that's held in national accounts, regional development banks, and if you're really lucky, you have available in country tourism satellite accounts, which break down data on the tourism sector at a much more granular level. And I think we were quite lucky in that 3 of the 4 countries that we operated in or operate in the project actually had national level tourism satellite accounts. So that was incredibly helpful for us to build value chains maps in these countries. And then for economic data sources, so if we're trying to understand the transaction values within the tourism value chain, we're trying to understand the economic relationships between different value chain partners. There are equally a whole range of sources that we can look for, some of which are international, some of which are the same sort of sources like national statistics bureaus, but would include things like information held by regional development banks or investment agencies or trade and development organizations and donors. And equally, potentially tourism businesses themselves in the form of annual reports and accounts. There's a few acronyms in here you might not be familiar with, like QMS and EMS. So QMS is Quality Management System, EMS is Environmental Management System. So these are systems that are used that use international standards to manage the quality and the environmental impact performance of tourism businesses. So we could have procurement data platforms as well. And then on the right-hand side, when we look at environmental data sources, you could have the Ministry of Environment, you might have regulatory bodies and agencies. Indeed, you could have utilities companies like energy and water companies who can provide you with information. And similarly, waste management companies. You may be lucky enough to have a government that keeps national green accounts with environmental information in them. Or you can reach out to other UN agencies like the UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And they hold a lot of information around climate change emissions from different sectors and so on. So all sorts of different sources of information within these 3 boxes. And at the bottom of the slide, you'll see there are other potential data sources. And certainly we've used all of these in the project so far. So things like tourism conference papers and proceedings, specialist databases, academic and market research studies, and indeed media reports are very often a good indicator of emerging issues, particularly around environmental concerns within tourism. So it's always good to get a sense of more immediate emerging concerns as well by looking at some of the media coverage within tourism destinations. So I hope you can see there is a very broad range of data sets available to start helping you to build your value chain map. So that was very much focused on existing data sources, so what we describe as secondary data sources. But there's also the opportunity to work within tourism destinations and do some primary data collection, so collecting new data around some of these issues. And one of the approaches we've used within the project, and in fact I've used it in all sorts of different sectors of the economy, we describe it as walking the chain. And this is essentially working with value chain partners, engaging with them and working your way through the physical value chain from farm to fork in the case of food, or mine to product in the case of things like ICT equipment or furniture or construction materials. And it really helps us to do this because it's bringing all of the value chain partners together in a workshopping environment. And you can see from the photo I've put onto this slide that we are able to map all the stages of the value chain by working with value chain partners. We can see the physical flow of materials, we can see financial flows, we can identify information flows and points in the value chain where information may be held or processed that could help us to structure and input into our value chain map. And then finally, we can actually look at hotspots. So for example, a hotspot might be that there is insufficient wastewater treatment plants within a tourism destination, or not enough recycling infrastructure for solid waste. And all of these things come out of these sorts of mapping exercise. So once we've mapped the value chain, we can look at hotspots analysis to see where some of these hotspots sit physically within the value chain. And because we're working with partners, we can see who we can partner with to tackle them. So then we go through a solution generation exercise, we shortlist solutions, and we move to a business case and work plan to basically implement some of the solutions that we've identified by walking the chain. So it's a very powerful way of doing things. It takes a little time to set up and to build trust with value chain partners, but it's a really great way of getting new primary data. So we talked a bit about scoping the map and the importance of that. So just to give you an idea of visually how that can look. So you'll see here that with this particular example value chain map, we've highlighted some of the upstream value chain within the destination. So things like food and beverage, some of the food and beverage supply predominantly, accommodation within the destination, and the environmental impacts all highlighted in red that we're interested in, and all life cycle stages covered. So this is very much focused on accommodation, food and beverage, and support services within the destination. So this is just an example of how you pictorially describe the scope of a value chain map. And then what we've done here, and this is a live example from work we've done in the Dominican Republic with our amazing in-country partners. So we've looked at a whole range of different economic sources of data, and we've been able to start plotting where money is spent within the sector, who it's spent with, and the value of those transactions. And this is really helpful because it gives you an indication of your level of influence and your ability to partner with value chain partners to improve the performance of the sector. Now, I would say that certainly our experience of the 4 countries we've worked in, we've had varying levels of data available. So, for example, in this Dominican value chain map, if you look to the top left hand, you'll see that we were only able to find transaction values for both energy and water use. Whereas in other countries, we were able to split out data from national accounts and actually show those as separate energy use and water figures. And similarly for transportation services, we're able to get a total figure for all transportation services for the Dominican Republic, but we weren't able to break that down into things like the economic transactions relating to taxi companies or ferry companies, for example. So this really helps us to actually understand, in effect, where the money is in the tourism value chain, and that helps us to understand which economic transaction levers we can pull to build new partnerships and collaborations. So I'll take a pause there, and we'll take questions at this point.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. And so we have actually a question to which you answered partially already, related to whether the value chain analysis outcome is quantitative only. So maybe you just want to comment on that and on the fact that obviously there are not always a lot of data available. So yeah.
Yes, so I think wherever possible, we try and make the process quantitative because it feels more real. So we can actually understand that, as I've just described, the actual economic transactions within a value chain and those transaction partnerships within the value chain. But sometimes, as Sandra says, we simply don't have the data. So we are then talking to different value chain actors about their views on the most influential partners they could work with in particular circumstances. So, for example, if water stewardship, drinking water supply or wastewater is a key problem or challenge within a destination, then we would simply ask them to help us identify who the utilities company were and how we could speak to them and engage with them. And that is just a starting point of a conversation, which then hopefully gives us more access to more quantified information.
Thank you very much. And then we had 2 questions related to social impact or local people, local employment. One is where do you put the social impacts as local employment or land use and competition of the tourism infrastructures with local use or needs, such as agriculture, housing for locals, etc. Or where would that be in the value chain? I think it's going a little bit ahead of
Yeah,
the presentation, actually,
it
but
is. So
it's worth having it in mind.
yeah. Okay.
And
So
sorry, and there's the second one was about where do local people locate in this value chain and in the data collection process. So
okay, so let me take the second question first. So with the primary data collection, so when we're actually in a destination and working with our value chain partners and with ministries and agencies and others, and with the tourism associations and so on, we would do our best to actually get a very well-rounded view of the issues as a starting point qualitatively. And we would ask stakeholders whether they have any concerns, whether they believe there are opportunities that are being missed. So it's much more qualitative interview type or focus group type activity rather than necessarily sort of hardcore quantitative data gathering. It's trying to get a sense of where the issues might fall so that we can investigate those particular concerns or opportunities further. In terms of social dimensions to this, we haven't really used them that much in the project yet, but there are a number of ways in which to include social impacts within value chain maps. And our UN Environment colleagues within the UN Environment's Lifecycle initiative have actually developed a social impacts analysis methodology and guidance, which we would be happy to point you at if you were interested in trying to understand how to measure social impact and social benefit within tourism value chains.
thank you. And mindful of the time, I'll just try to respond to some questions that just arrived. One on which are the 3 other countries that we worked on, because you mentioned Dominican Republic, Mark. So we are working, the project is still ongoing, in Dominican Republic, Mauritius, St. Lucia, and the Philippines. And then another question related to how to get the amount of money invested in each topic, whether authorities are supposed to give them and I think there was a slide on data collection that Mark elaborated on, saying that yes, it could be linked to discussions, surveys, studies in the country, as well as some international data statistics or sets available. So I guess that's something, again, it is just to have a picture of what is of value, and so how do we actually make sure we tackle the life cycle environmental impact while safeguarding this value for the country or for the tourism stakeholders. Mark, if you agree, we can move on to the next bit of the presentation.
Okay,
so I'll give you the floor as well.
Thank you very much, Sandra. So the next section of the presentation is about identifying the value chain actors and influencers within a tourism value chain, but also starting to look at where the tourism assets are and where any potential risks might lie. So this is a very simple kind of pictorial layered view of how we identify stakeholders, look at tourism assets and try to identify risks. And again, you'll see at the bottom there, we adopt a life cycle stage approach from raw material to end of life. But we start with any international and regional organizations that are engaged with or have influence on the tourism value chain in a given country or destination. We often talk to banks, investors, donors, and shareholders because that gives us a very well-rounded sense of how the tourism sector is operated, how well invested in it is, and the kind of underlying financial structure of the tourism value chain. We clearly, one of our first stopping points is nearly always the relevant government ministries and agencies as well. And in some cases we found, and this was particularly the case in the Philippines, that actually local government departments are critical, because a lot of the infrastructure requirements like drinking water supply, wastewater treatment, energy supply even, are devolved down to local government department level. So this does add a level of complexity to understanding the tourism value chain, but it is critically important that we understand how the interactions between central government ministries and local government departments work, and the sort of information that both of those segments of the public sector can provide. And then there is, of course, the infrastructure support for tourism. So who is it that is providing the energy, the water, the transportation, the information and communication technology, the maintenance services, and so on, that actually allow the tourism sector to operate on a daily basis. And then within the product and service value chain, the primary producers, so they could include farmers, growers, fishermen, timber suppliers, fuel suppliers, mining companies, and so on. Who is actively involved? When we take that broader value chain view of things, can we reach out right back upstream within the value chain and start to identify, for example, with food, where the major production zones are for our food products, whether they're domestic or potentially out of the country? And then product manufacturers or service providers. So who are our main tier 1 or tier 2 suppliers there? Wholesalers and retailers, sometimes quite an important thing to understand as well, because the intermediaries between where, for example, food is produced and how it reaches a retail or a restaurant environment can be quite important in terms of understanding things like food waste, for example. And then in consumption as well. So the businesses and the guests, who are the principal hotel groups within a destination, where are the main restaurant chains or the main food and beverage suppliers, and then finally the kind of the waste, the end of life stuff, the waste management companies, the recycling infrastructure, and so on. And you'll see here that as we go through this, we start to identify some risks. So we start to appreciate, for example, maybe that the chances are that a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions are originating in agriculture, from agricultural practices or the raising of livestock. Or we might discover that there is a monopolistic energy supply situation within a country. And this actually did occur in 2 of the countries we're working in. And that can lead to high energy costs in different destinations. So it's perhaps more of an incentive to look at energy efficiency programs, or even installing in situ renewable energy supply within a destination. And then at the consumption phase, we might find that road congestion might become an issue and have an impact on the tourism experience. And certainly in some of the countries we've worked in, for example, the Philippines, road congestion is a major issue. So one of the things we've been looking at in the Philippines is how do we improve the public transport infrastructure there as a way of making tourism more attractive, but also the daily lives of people that live in the destinations. And then in green, in these green bubbles here, we are starting to identify some of the assets within the tourism sector and the broader economy. So, for example, we might identify an ancient intact forest which has a huge tourism utility to it. It's an attraction in its own right. Or we might realise that most of the drinking water supply comes from an aquifer, and therefore that aquifer needs to be protected and not over-abstracted. We might have national parks in or around the destination that are a big pull for tourism and visits. And clearly with a lot of tourism destinations, we would want to maintain and protect our pristine beaches, reefs, lakes, and so on and so forth. So going through this process, we can really start to pick out who it is we need to work with, who's operating in the sector, where our key assets are, and potentially where some of our overarching risks to the resilience of the tourism sector are. So in case you're wondering what this might start to look like on your tourism value chain map, You will see here in the purple writing that for the Dominican Republic, this was actually about halfway through the process, but we've actually started to identify, for example, the key hotel chains in the destinations we were working in, the cruise companies that we were operating there, the waste companies, the water companies, the energy providers, the wholesalers. And in the red text here, the red bold text here, we've obviously started to identify some of the risks. So, for example, we'd identified that there was over abstraction of drinking water supply and not a great deal of public wastewater treatment. So the sector is going to need to invest in situ wastewater treatment plants within destinations. We identified that there was a monopolistic supply in terms of food wholesale and in terms of energy supply. And on the waste side, we identified that there was a major environmental issue surrounding a very large but unlicensed landfill site. And that was causing a definite loss of tourism amenity and needed to be addressed. So all of these things, as we go through this process, we can start to map and plot on our tourism value chain map. So it becomes a clear visual cue to us of where our partners are, where our challenges are, and where our opportunities and our assets are. And very often when we find, we've done the stakeholder mapping exercise in particular, there are an enormous number of stakeholders that might be involved in a tourism value chain. And so what we do is a prioritization exercise in a 2x2 matrix like this. So you'll see here, for the Dominican Republic, the key actors that we wanted to engage with and manage closely because of their high level of influence or high level of expertise in the sector are described here. So some of the hotel associations, the Ministry of Environment, and so on. And doing a grid-based matrix like this, although it's quite qualitative in many respects, it really does help you to better understand those stakeholders that you should be spending more time with as you try to understand how to build your value chain map and address some of the environmental, social, and economic issues within the value chain. Okay. So that was the piece which was all around identifying stakeholders, assets, and risks within the value chain. So we're starting to build a picture of what our value chain looks like. We've scoped it out, and we've got a very clear sense of the transaction values. Now we're going to move into looking at the life cycle impacts that might be associated with a tourism value chain and how we assign those. So going back to our old friend, the life cycle stage diagram, again, raw materials to disposal. So at this point, we have mapped those life cycle stages within our value chain map. And that could be for the whole sector. It could be for a destination or for an individual tourism business or its value chain. And we're starting to think here about what are the natural resource inputs, the waste arisings, the greenhouse gas emissions for each of the life cycle stages. In the table at the bottom of the slide, we've just provided some example answers here. So, for example, and I'll just pick on a couple of these because time doesn't allow me to go through all of them. But say for raw materials, then we've identified that there's a significant input of agricultural food crops. We're using quite a lot of land to supply them or for tourism itself within the destination. We're using water, we're using minerals and so on. And then in the bottom row of that table, we're starting to identify some of the environmental impacts from those activities or processes. So the generation of greenhouse gas emissions, the potential to waste food, the creation of wastewater that needs to be treated. And then similarly in manufacturing, we're likely to need energy to manufacture food or other tourism products. We're going to be using water. So we're generating, again, greenhouse gas emissions, we're creating other forms of solid waste, and we're probably creating more wastewater. So we're trying to understand the relationship between the life cycle stage, the stage in the value chain map, and the likely environmental impacts or issues that result from those activities and processes. So having done that, we start to become a bit more specific maybe. So I'll just take a single example from this slide. So if we look at the raw materials again, one of the key issues is going to be around land use and land use change. And this was we took some examples from the Philippines here. So we have some challenges around wild caught fish stocks. And what we're trying to do here is link those environmental impacts we might have identified at different stages in the value chain or in the life cycle, the product and service life cycle, to the likely impacts of that, and then look at whether we believe those impacts are, what the likely severity of those impacts are, whether they're high, medium, or low. Now this, because I know you'll probably ask a question on this at some point, this can start off being qualitative, but if, for example, you realize that an impact is high and may require some OPEX or CAPEX investment, then it's quite likely you'll need to do a bit more quantitative investigation of the impact or the issue, or maybe engage with a relevant government ministry or a utility company to try and understand what a solution might look like. So we might find here that, for example, we've had some biodiversity loss in a natural resource environment which tourism depends upon to draw tourists. Or we might be experiencing a depletion of fish stocks because we've got overfishing because of an increase in visitor numbers. So all of these sorts of things we need to think through and start to plot onto the value chain map. So that just gives you a very brief overview of the life cycle thinking element of value chain mapping. Now, what very often comes out of that process of identifying environmental impacts is you can end up with quite a long and often what feels like a very debilitating list of issues to deal with. So what we have been working on within the project is how do we prioritize those environmental impacts, and how do we then prioritize the actions that we need to take to address them. And we do this through a relatively new technique called Hotspots Analysis. And this basically shows you the 8-stage process for Hotspots Analysis. And this is a methodology and some guidance that UN Environment's Lifecycle Initiative has developed. I was very privileged to co-lead this piece of work. It was a piece of work that was long overdue because a lot of people were becoming frustrated with the amount of issues that they were required to address. So Hotspots Analysis is all about getting to the really, really important issues, the significant issues around environmental impact, so that you can really focus your efforts and your resources on tackling those things that are most important. So in this particular project, when we talk about an environmental impact hotspot, we're talking about something that represents 50% or more of the environmental impact across an entire product or service lifecycle. So it has to be something pretty significant. And as you see from the diagram on the left, we follow a very similar route to what we're following for the value chain mapping itself. So we're defining our goal and scope for the hotspots analysis. What is it we want from it? What is the, if you like, the boundaries for it? How do we gather the data or seek expert insight if the data is not available? How can we identify and validate those hotspots? How can we then prioritize them? Identify any implementation gaps. And I'll come on to this in a second, because very often we find that there are existing initiatives within the tourism sector that are already addressing hotspots that we need to be aware of so we don't duplicate effort. And then reviewing and validating those initial findings from the hotspots analysis with key tourism stakeholders and experts, presenting those findings to the stakeholders within the locale, and then reviewing and revisiting the hotspots analysis over time when we feel we've addressed some of those priority hotspots in the first instance, and we might want to move on to the next ones in our list. So it's a very kind of plan, do, check, act approach. To keep it really simple, so this is just looking at how we might start to think about prioritizing our life cycle impacts using hotspots analysis. So on the left-hand side of this matrix, you'll see product service life cycle stages that we've talked about ad nauseum now, and then the sort of different types of environmental impact that you might come across when you're looking at your value chain map and trying to understand the environmental impacts within tourism. And we've restricted these to the more, if you like, practical, visual, important ones like waste, GHG emissions, energy use, water use, and so on. But we have a column here where we can also capture other important environmental impacts like biodiversity loss. So we use this matrix in a workshopping environment. We would typically allow delegates, or participants in the workshop, probably about an hour to to go through this and to use it really to understand where the priorities are. So if I show you, I'll show you a few examples at the product level in a second, but let me just give you a bit more kind of guidance on how we use this. So it's really meant to identify and define those key sustainability hotspots associated with a product or service in the tourism sector. It's largely at this stage a qualitative approach, a kind of 80-20 principle, a best guess insight based on professional judgment, experience in the sector, and so on. As I've already said, the primary hotspots would contribute more than 50% of the total life cycle impact across all life cycle stages. Sometimes it's useful to capture secondary, perhaps not quite as significant hotspots as well. So we typically characterize those as a quarter to a half of total life cycle impact across life cycle stages. I hope the jargon is not burying you too much at this point. And then we also give ourselves the opportunity to recognize that some hotspots are already being addressed. So let me show you what that might look like for a fairly simple product. In this case, it's beef. So you can see here the red cells in the matrix indicate the primary hotspots. So it's things like the fact that methane emissions from cattle or manure management generate a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions in the food chain for tourism, or that you might be using a lot of water in the rearing and cleaning and feed production for livestock. Or at the use consumption stage, you could be experiencing high levels of meat waste in hotels and restaurants. And that could be mainly from plate waste, or it could be from kitchen preparation and cooking. And you might have also come across, if you look at the disposal reuse stage, the green cell there, the fact that the food supplier has developed a novel packaging system. So this is a vacuum packing system, we call it a skin pack system, which vacuum packs joints of beef and extends the shelf life by at least a week. So this is a really good initiative that helps to reduce food waste. And then below the matrix, we try and identify some of the key kind of narratives and variables around this particular hotspot. So whether it's drawing out or emphasizing that the main hotspot for greenhouse gas emissions, energy, water, and biodiversity relate to cattle rearing, or a key variable might be the production system you're using for beef, whether it's, for example, grass-fed or corn-fed. So hopefully this gives you an idea of how this looks using an example. I have another one for beer here, which I'm not going to go through, other than to say we were pretty horrified when we discovered that it takes 120, typically it takes 120 litres of water to produce 1 litre of beer. That was quite a shocking moment for a few of us anyway. So having gone through that process, and I should say those were for food products, but we can use that grid for all sorts of different things as well. We could use it for furniture, we could use it for infrastructure, we could use it in fact for a whole hotel if we wanted to. Just use it as a way of kind of coalescing your thinking and your understanding of where the environmental impacts might lie within the tourism sector, within the tourism value chain. So having done that, it's time to kind of summarize and rank those hotspots. So again, we might find we have a number and it's an unworkable number of hotspots. So we tend to use a tabular approach to start with. So the first thing we'll do, we'll organize the hotspots we've identified by environmental impact. So things like greenhouse gas emissions, energy, water, waste. The second thing we'll do is we'll try and clearly describe the location and the magnitude of each hotspot. And wherever possible, we'll cite references as well as to where that information has come from. So it could have come from, for example, a food waste audit, a kitchen audit in a hotel might have told us that actually 30% of the food that was purchased by the hotel is actually being wasted at that point. Or it could be an international data source that we have discovered in the process. So that's the second thing, clearly identify and describe the location, the magnitude of the hotspot and the sources for that information. The third thing then is to rank the hotspots in order of significance for each environmental impact. So you're prioritizing them for action. And then what we're doing is assigning a number to those hotspots so that we can use that number as a shorthand for the hotspot without having to spell out all the detail necessarily. And I should say step 4 here is actually to use footnotes to help you with additional information sources or explanations of information around each hotspot as well. So it's a very simple tabular format. When you go back to your value chain map, this is just a very neat way of just summarizing it. So you take that numbering system and you plug in that number of hotspot to the location in the value chain. And you can see at the bottom of the value chain map, we've just provided a very short and sharp description of each of the hotspots. So the table provides more information. This is just a summary information set of where those hotspots are. And you'll also see that we've overlaid that onto our identification of stakeholders within the value chain. So we can immediately see where the hotspot is located and who we can work with to address it. And because we like pictures, sometimes we create some nice infographics around this. So again, this is drawing on all of the hotspots analysis and the lifecycle impact identification we did for the Dominican Republic. And we've simply put it into perhaps a more digestible infographic form to show how the value chain is working, the different stages in the value chain, and where those hotspots sit. So, for example, where you see the image of the hotel and restaurant there, you'll see one of the things we identified in the Dominican Republic is that guests tend to use 3 times more water in a destination than citizens. So again, this is just a very simple way of visualizing. Okay.
Thank you, Mark.
Pause.
You can drink a
Yeah.
little bit of water. Thanks a lot, and I think that's actually a great transition, and we'll try to stick to about 5 minutes answering the questions we received, so we'll try to be very straight to the point, but it's a very good transition to a question that we received related to locals. So saying such stages of the value chain, and I guess referring to, you know, the distribution of goods and services, as well as the waste management phase, for example, are also part of the lifestyle of locals, and the services of a destination are also used by locals. How can you assign the impacts to just the tourism sector or the tourists?
That's a very good question.
One, huh? Yeah.
It's almost impossible. Unless the restaurant is, for example, is linked to a hotel, and you can actually see which hotel guests are frequenting the restaurant because you can see their room numbers, or because you can see the billing on their hotel bills at the end of their stay. It is very, very difficult to do, and it's something that it's very hard to get to that level of granularity as well. You could do it with, so we've seen one destination that has used questionnaires to understand how their restaurant was being used. And we were asking them about how did they think a restaurant could reduce food waste, and what was their role in that, which was quite an interesting thing to do in a tourism destination where people very often don't actually think that much about food waste because they're on holiday. And that was a very useful way of doing it, because we actually did get a sense of the proportion of visitors versus locals. But that would generally require some primary data gathering through something like a questionnaire within a destination. It's not impossible, but it is a little bit time and resource intensive to do something like that. We can make assumptions. We could, based on the experience of the restaurant owner or the experience of the hotel operator, they may have a view on what proportion of their diners are locals versus visitors or guests. But that would obviously be much more qualitative. It would be quicker, but it would be qualitative. So we'd have to state what our assumptions are in that case.
Yeah, and I think the when we talk about the tourism sector here, it's more of a way to trigger change rather than trying to go too deep in the assessment of what is really drawn from the tourism operations and what is actually also used by local, but it's like, how can we all together act and drive change towards sustainability. So
yeah, behavior changes for everyone.
yeah. Another question related to shedding more light on the direct emission. So I think it comes back to the value chain map, shedding more light on the direct emission and energy efficiency that are mentioned in the tourism value chain.
So some of the ways in which we've done that. So we have used a tool within the project which helps hotels to understand their energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So this is it's not like a calculator tool. And I know that the hotel chains that have used it have found it incredibly useful. So this is developed by one of our partners in the project, the Danish Technical University, and they have produced this tool, and it's basically like an input-output tool. So you put the amount of energy you use, the sources for that energy, whether it's on-site generators or renewable energy, for example, or natural gas versus coal. And it has within it emissions factors that allow us to make distinctions between greenhouse gas emissions from different electricity generating sources. And that has proved to be a very valuable tool, because it's helped us to understand how the energy is generated and how much energy hotels use, and then as a direct result of that energy use, what the likely greenhouse gas emissions are. At the national level, there are things like national communications to the UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, which they can vary in frequency, but they're usually anything from every 2 to 4 years. And that is a kind of top level view of the climate change impacts and energy use, or indeed the mitigation initiatives within a country. So that is reported directly to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, in part possibly to address the monitoring and reporting requirements of the Paris Agreement. So you can do it at the national level, you can do it at the business level, and you can use the tool that we've created to help you do that at the business level.
Thank you. I'll try to answer 2 questions that are that just arrived. One, and sorry for the connectivity issues that some may be encountering, related to the example of beef or beer, and the attendee wanted to know if the raw materials step was not being considered to have an impact. And I think if you look at the slide, it shows that many of the major impact are actually at raw material, so growing food, agriculture, as well as water resources stage. So that's also the reason why it is so important, and it has been designated as a hotspot in the context of most of the countries we've been working with.
Agricultural emissions, I think in most of the countries we're working in, of anything between 30 and 45% of overall greenhouse gas emissions, sometimes larger. And certainly, I mean, agriculture it's fairly well known, I think, that agriculture uses just over 70% of all fresh water on the planet. So it's quite likely that any agricultural setup is likely to be a fairly heavy water user, whether you're growing crops or keeping livestock.
Thank you. And another one was also related to tackling circularity and elaborating a bit on circular economy and tourism. Actually, circular economy is really a way to and an approach to achieve sustainable consumption and production, and therefore also sustainable tourism. So it's very likely that on all of these hotspots that you're seeing now, and on the next stage of the presentation that we'll be looking at some solutions. Some solutions are actually how do you implement some circularity and circular economy in practice within the tourism sector. whether it's from a preventive stage, if we think of plastics, for example, or if we think of changing electric appliances, or whether it's at the waste management stage. So maybe that would be my transition to continue the presentation, because we have about 20 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. Moving swiftly on. Okay, so as I said earlier, one of the key things that it's important to understand as well is what existing initiatives are already in place that may already be addressing some of these hotspots, because you may be able to join a collaboration, or certainly you probably want to avoid any duplication, or indeed you might want to learn from an existing initiative. So this slide is just really two ways of identifying putting together two ways of identifying where existing initiatives within tourism value chains might be. And the first, and this is one we've used quite exhaustively, is desktop research. So we've tried to understand from a range of different sources, doing desktop research, where existing initiatives might be, who they're being run by, and whether they're operating at an international, a national, or a destination or a sectoral level, or indeed at the business value chain level. Excuse me. And I won't go into too much detail with these, but you can see there are all sorts of different ways using a desktop-based approach that you can identify existing initiatives on a range of different issues to cover a range of different hotspots. The second one, which isn't that well represented here, is surveys. So we have, in the 4 countries we've worked in, done survey work with our partners in country and the tourism stakeholders we've been working with, and they have been able to give us some really kind of interesting insight and intelligence around what is already there. And in some cases, we've actually gone to existing initiatives and worked with them. And in other cases, we've identified there are some implementation gaps in relation to a given hotspot, and we are in the process of developing new collaborations to try and address them. So that's probably all I'll say about this slide, because there is a lot of detail in it, and you can read it when you download the slide deck. So we've talked a lot about the life cycle approach, environmental impacts, using hotspots analysis to prioritize those environmental impacts and rank them, and to categorize them. Now we're going to talk a little bit about identifying and shortlisting some solutions to them. And we've done this again in workshops, and it's been a very powerful but simple tool. So we use this this template here. We use one for business solutions and one for national level, more policy solutions. But it's an idea generation exercise that we run within the project. So we're looking at business solutions that might be products, services, changes in business models, new collaborations, could be all sorts of things. And the idea is, on the left-hand side of the matrix, we get as many ideas as we can down in around half an hour normally. We normally find we have at least 20 ideas per workshop group. And then we ask those individual groups to rank those solutions that they've identified. And you can see there are a series of filters across the top of the matrix. So we talk about cost of implementation, sustainability and consumer benefit, business benefit, the issues around technical and commercial feasibility, difficulty in implementing, priority, and then timeframes. And those last two are quite important to us, because they, as you'll see in a minute, they help us to start road mapping solutions. So looking at what we could do in the short, medium and long term. It's worth noting that wherever we run these workshops, we've run them with both businesses and public sector stakeholders in tourism in the room. So we have policymakers in the room as well. And we found that's very helpful to generate a kind of cross-fertilization of ideas as well. And sometimes businesses are coming up with solutions that policies could support, or sometimes businesses weren't aware that there were supportive policies in place. So that's a really useful way of doing things. So that's for business solutions. For national level solutions, where we might be talking about policies, strategies, or legal and regulatory frameworks, there are some slightly different filters here. So we still talk about cost to implement, but we talk about slightly different things like sustainability benefit and societal benefit, or whether a potential national level policy solution would actually support business action. And again, the idea here would be to prioritize maybe 2 or 3 key ideas or interventions and take those forwards for further thought. And again, short, medium and long-term thinking as well in that. So having produced our long list and done some short listing, we then start to develop some very simple kind of roadmaps. So we use this sort of template here. So you'll see here that there are 3 blocks. One is for short term, one is for medium term, and one is for longer term innovation. And we describe the hotspots that we want to work on the left-hand side. And then we map our solutions according to how they relate to the hotspots. And as you can see here, in some cases, we found solutions which actually address more than one hotspot. So we've got that upward arrow coming out of the the green circle. You can see that those solutions have been identified as addressing more than one hotspot. So this is an ideal for us, one solution addressing multiple hotspots. And you can see here that for some hotspots, there may be a short-term activity that may extend to a longer-term innovation or something like the need to implement new or improve new public infrastructure like waste infrastructure or water supply. And that is going to take quite a long time. In terms of what we mean by short, medium and long term, we've tended to use 1 to 3 years for short term, 4 to 6 for medium, and up to or over 10 years for the longer term solutions. Just as a way, but you would be free to define short, medium, and long term any way you would want to. That's just how we've done it within the project. This is just a really nice piece of road mapping guidance. It's been produced by the UK's Sustainable Development Commission. It's predominantly around how to roadmap products, sustainability and product innovation. But there's a lot of cross-learning from product road mapping that we can apply to sectoral road mapping and use within tourism. So finally, when we've got all of our solutions, we've road mapped them, we've got some shortlisted solutions that we want to apply. Those shortlisted solutions might be at the national level in terms of policy, at the sectoral level, or even at the business value chain level. And we found it's really useful to cluster and put some structure around those solutions that we've identified. And we term these kind of clusters as effectively as systemic solutions. So what we mean by that is a systemic solution would represent a strategic theme for tackling environmental impacts or a natural umbrella for a cluster of actions or interventions with the same kind of overarching goal. And those systemic solutions were identified for or by each country, location, tourism business or group of tourism businesses. And they can bring together as many of those shortlisted solutions as possible. So rather than talk about that in any more detail, let me just show you what that can look like. And again, this is it's actually a draft strategic solutions map for the Dominican Republic. So you see here at the top, there is an overarching aim, which is to improve the sustainability performance of tourism value chains in the Dominican Republic. There are 3 key issues we're trying to address. So resource use and greenhouse gas emissions in food production, reducing pollution and waste in the Dominican Republic, and reducing the use the consumption of fossil fuels by the tourism sector in the Dominican Republic. And then we have some outcomes there that we'd like to see. And then we have in dark green our systemic solutions, which we titled transforming, in this case, transforming the inclusive model, beating pollution in tourism, and sustainable energy programs for hotels and restaurants. And you'll see below that in light green, we have a series of national, cross-sectoral and business level solutions that we have clustered under each of these systemic solutions. So it's almost like a logic map in one sense. We are trying to understand how to cluster solutions to deliver a strategic goal. And this is a really easy way of doing that. Over to you, Sandra.
Thank you very much. And I would suggest we do not pause for questions now. I will just go through section 8 and 9. And if you are in agreement with that, maybe we'll take an additional 10 minutes for the remaining questions at the end of the presentation. So let me show my screen. Okay, so I'll present here two sections, one that is rather focusing on a business tool and another one on the policy tool. But from, and maybe I'll go back to the previous slide that Mark presented. From what he presented, the reason why we're talking about systemic solution is actually because it is a whole system change that we're looking into when we look at the tourism value chain that is involving the different actors at different level, different timing, and for specific action that they have to do in a kind of orchestrated way. So while these tools are specific to specific group of actors, they are really there to help the different actors of the tourism value chain to play their role and to collectively have a benefit and have a beneficial impact on sustainability. So this is about a business case, and I'll just try to use a new tool. So this is a business case model that is the business model Canva, and the objective is to help the private sector, so hotels, restaurant owners, crafters, providers of excursion or tourism attractions, for example, in destination, to put sustainability at the heart of their business model, and to make sure that actually it is a win-win-win situation related to environment, social impact, so including employment and economic impact for the business. So the way you would use this tool is actually to start with the value proposition and saying what is your idea that showcase the sustainability and that tells your customer what you will be offering them. Then you would actually be filling the business model Canva through looking at the customer aspect and customer channel, and looking at what do you need in terms of activities to make your product or your service, and what are the resources and related partners that you would need. Finally, you would make sure that in terms of economic activities, you actually are safe and you have implementation costs that are potentially lower than revenue stream with a good return on investment within a couple of months or years, or depending on the size of your business, that you also have a good balance in terms of social and environmental costs compared to the benefits. So to give you just an example of how this could look like, you have an example on food waste prevention that was conducted by RAP and by the World Resources Institute in more than 100 restaurants across 12 countries. And it showed a very basic but powerful value that every $1 invested in food waste prevention or reduction program in a restaurant would help save the restaurant $7. So clearly a financial benefit. On average, restaurants achieved about 26% reduction of kitchen food waste in just 1 year. So within first year, more than 75% had managed to recoup their investment, while within 2 years, 90%. So the payback time was quite interesting as well. I think it's just a call for action here, and a call for making sure that you have actions that are helpful to achieve successful reduction programs. So key strategies were put forward: measuring, engaging staff, rethinking the inventory and purchasing practice through purchasing, and there is a lot of power and powerful tools and means for driving to sustainability, including, for example, when talking about food, purchasing some local items rather than importing, reducing overproduction and repurposing excess food. These are a few examples as well that you'll be able to read through when downloading the slide deck related to energy efficiency, with efficient LED lighting, or related to heating, ventilation, air conditioning systems, as well as the installation of room energy management systems. To briefly talk about the creating a supportive policy framework. From what we try to showcase during this training is that everybody has a role, and it's by collectively thinking of solutions together through these systemic solutions that we will be finding relevant solutions. And when Mark referred to workshop and the tools that we've been using in workshop, it's one of these moments where we try to pull together in the same room actually the tourism businesses, so hotels, restaurants, or conference organizers, as well as their suppliers, as well as the waste management businesses and authorities, ideally from the tourism business and hotels, the staff, as well as the procurers, and making sure that the local authority and the national authority representatives would be also there in the room. So the supportive policy framework is a supportive policy framework to all the actors. So this is just a kind of theoretical analysis of how do you build a policy framework. And it's called the policy cycle, starting with a problem framing, then with policy formulation, then going into policy implementation and monitoring and evaluation. And I think what is really important to highlight is that it needs to be based on the national or local context and to involve as many stakeholders as possible. And as you probably have seen, when we look at the tourism value chain, we actually do not necessarily look into having only tourism experts in the room, but also having experts related to energy efficiency, energy appliances, related to circular economy and circularity in general, agriculture expert for as well, so a large variety of these stakeholders. I won't go into details, and you'll be able to quietly look at the details of how we can pick and choose different types of instruments in order to have a satisfactory policy mix that is applicable for the country, the location. So picking from regulatory instruments such as bans, for example, thinking of single-use plastics, for example, economic instruments that could be taxes or incentives, that could be extended producer responsibility, as well as sustainable procurement practices and support, information-based instruments, including eco-labels, for example, voluntary instruments, with voluntary agreement, often in a public-private partnership, as well as behavioral instruments that would include behavior change campaigns, for example. All these instruments have actually pros and cons, so it's really important to make sure they are well adapted to the situation of the country, and making sure that we actually do look into key policy considerations and answer the questions that are here in this table. So it's a kind of checklist in a way that can be used when trying to apply this policy circle. And I would like to highlight 2 of them, or 3 of them, actually very relevant to the training today. One is adopting the life cycle thinking and looking at the impacts from a life cycle perspective at the different stages, impacts that would be environmental, and you have seen today environmental impact are a strong focus, but also social impact. And then applying a value chain approach so that we understand who are the main actors at the different stages of the value chain, and how can we make sure that they get motivated into this journey to sustainability, which links to building collaboration as well. Finally, as a final slide, I wanted to highlight the importance of this systemic solution. And as a policymaker, developing a mix of policy and instrument, the important to always keep in mind what is the overarching aim of the tourism policy framework, which is called here and highlighted through what's the golden thread. So every time setting up a policy framework is actually supporting this aim that is in blue on top of this picture, and making sure every time that this is kept in mind, and the systemic solutions, the outcomes, and the overall aim are actually achieved and supported by the policy framework. So I think it's time for just a couple of further questions. Yes.
So
Please.
someone, Sandra, asked what was the greenhouse gas calculator tool that I talked about. What's it called? It's called the Gasamo tool. And if anyone wants to get in touch with the Sustainable Tourism Programme at UN Environment, they will be able to signpost you to that tool and the people that created it.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think there was also a question related to food, and saying, well, obviously the local food type and production will have less impact than imported food. Would customer be able to accept that when they are on holidays?
So I think this very much depends on the food type. So when I was going through that matrix for what we call the hotspots profiler, that matrix which shows you where the primary and secondary hotspots are and where they might be being addressed already, one of the things to bear in mind with food is it's not just about whether it's domestically produced or imported. It's the mode of importation, so whether it could be sea freight or air freight, that has a big difference on greenhouse gas emissions. But also it's about the production system. So it may be that you have grass-fed beef, for example, in an overseas supply zone, but you're having to feed domestic cattle or livestock on imported corn or imported soy. And sometimes the fact that you've had to import the feed is actually almost as important as where the beef comes from. So it's important to understand the production system that relates to the food, as well as where the food is coming from. Obviously, personal preference plays a big part here, and some tourists will want to see high quality food wherever that comes from. I would argue in a lot of cases you get just as good quality food from domestic production as you do from imported food. But again, that very much depends on the food stuff you're talking about.
Yeah, and maybe from a less technical perspective and maybe a bit more qualitative, I think that there is a trend today in the tourism sector, and of course, depending on the type of tourism as well, and whether it's a mass and very looking for low price tourism or a bit higher level, there is more and more tendency to value the local culture, local food, local growing. So we do see developing, even in chains such as TUI or Club Med, actually some local course of cuisine with local food, visits to local garden. So there is, I think, a tendency to look for this freshness, as well as highlighting local food and local production as a tourism and cultural experience as well. So
Yeah, it's very true. A lot of tourists are much more interested in the provenance of the food they're eating than they used to be. And in fact, some tourism destinations are actually providing tours to artisanal fishing villages, to rice paddies, and as part of the tourism experience itself, reconnecting the tourists with where the food has come from. It's become quite a powerful thing, part of ecotourism, agri-tourism as well.
Mm. And in terms of social impact, and in our in the tool that we're presenting here, this is one element that we do not want to miss, even if it's not a big highlight in the hotspot, as you've seen greenhouse gas emissions or water, etc. Is of course this is a great plus in terms of local employment as well. So should a business or even a locality or a country make a decision, this is obviously something that needs to be taken into account. There was also a question, and maybe given the time, I guess we can consider it would be the last question. There was a question related to the common challenges that we have faced in developing value chain maps in the 4 countries, and I guess we could extend that to going through the whole exercise of going from the value chain map to identifying systemic solutions, whether there were some commonalities from the work in Dominican Republic, the Philippines, St. Lucia, and Mauritius. Mark, do you want to give it a try?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. So we had a similar question, not quite as expansive as this one yesterday in the webinar yesterday, but one of the issues that we have faced, particularly when we're looking at transaction values, and I kind of alluded to this when I talked through the particular slide where we highlighted the transaction values in the Dominican Republic. And this was around how granular the transaction data is from national accounts and other national data sets. It can sometimes be very frustrating when you've seen say like in the Dominican Republic, there are some hotspots that we identified around drinking water sources and wastewater and things like that, and then to go and try and understand what the nature of the economic relationship is between the water utility company and the tourism sector, and you're trying to understand the value of that, and you can't get it, and all you can get at is the combined value of the transactions across the whole utility sector, including energy. That can be quite frustrating. The other challenge I think we had was with international hotel chains. Very often the procurement activity, the basis for all of these transactions is done offshore from the destination, and it's quite hard to unpick that transaction trail. because you have a centralized procurement team that may be providing product for tens, even hundreds of countries. So unpicking it in a way that you can identify the transaction value of the sourcing for the Dominican Republic alone can be quite challenging. Whereas maybe for a local hotel that's locally owned, it's much easier to get at that procurement data because it's actually on site, in situ, in the hotel procurement office. And that will just depend, I guess the challenges you face there will just depend on the nature and shape of tourism in the destination.
Thank you very much. And I think from a really topic and a hotspot of focus point of view, we had quite some similarities identifying some food items, some energy appliances. Plastic was also mentioned as an area of work. Probably water consumption in general as well. Am I missing any?
Lack of infrastructure was quite common as well.
Yeah.
And is causing quite a few problems too.
Yes, and as mentioned earlier, from a circular economy and a value chain point of view, looking at the long-term infrastructure investment is important towards waste, but as much as having some more quick and short-term solutions that can be done in terms of prevention upstream of the waste management. But well, I guess it is time to thank you all for a very well attended webinar and to provide you with some further information on the One Planet Sustainable Tourism Program and contact. There will be other online training and webinars. We hope you appreciated this first one. And I would like to thank Mark for his very clear and articulated presentation, as well as Svetlana and Maëlys for their support behind their computer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone. Really appreciated your attendance.
Goodbye. Have a good day.
Goodbye.